The crack of knuckles against bone echoed through the narrow alley behind Murphy's boxing gym in South Philadelphia. But Marcus, the ghost Williams, barely registered the sound anymore. He'd heard it 10,000 times in his 15 years of underground fighting, had made that sound himself more often than he cared to remember. What made him look up from wrapping his hands wasn't the violence, it was the desperate gasping of a child trying to catch his breath between sobs. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his sneakers worn through at the toes, his thin jacket providing no protection against the November cold. But it was his eyes that stopped Marcus cold, eyes that held a terror no child should ever know. "They're beating my mama," the boy gasped, his small hands gripping Marcus's shirt with surprising strength. "Please, mister, they're gonna kill her." Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. This wasn't how Marcus Williams had planned to spend his Thursday evening. He'd been preparing for a fight the following night against a Russian enforcer who had a reputation for ending careers, and he needed every minute of training he could get. At 34, Marcus was past his prime by underground fighting standards, his body a roadmap of scar tissue and old injuries that ached when it rained. The Ghost nickname had come from his ability to slip punches that should have connected, to move through opponents' defenses like smoke through a chain-link fence. But lately, the Ghost had been moving slower, taking hits that once would have missed by inches. The boy's name was Deshaun Miller, and his story spilled out in fragments as Marcus followed him through the darkening streets of North Philadelphia. His mother, Keisha, worked as a home health aide for elderly clients throughout the city, taking buses across town at all hours to reach apartments where people needed help with daily tasks their own families couldn't or wouldn't provide. She'd been caring for an old man named Vincent Russo for 6 months, helping him with medications, preparing meals, and keeping him company in the final months of what doctors said was terminal cancer. What Keisha hadn't known was that Vincent Russo was the uncle of Tony Russo, who ran a loan sharking operation out of a pawn shop on Allegheny Avenue. When the old man died 2 weeks ago, Tony and his crew had gone through Vincent's apartment looking for cash they believed the old man had hidden from the family. When they couldn't find it, they decided that Keisha must have stolen it during her time caring for him. The fact that there was no evidence of theft, that Keisha had been thoroughly background checked by the home health agency, and that she'd never shown any signs of having extra money meant nothing to Tony Russo. He needed someone to blame for his uncle's missing fortune, and the black woman who'd been alone with the old man for hours each day made a convenient target. Marcus reached the apartment building on Germantown Avenue, just as Tony Russo's fist connected with Keisha's jaw for the third time. She was on the floor of her own living room, blood running from her nose and mouth, while two of Tony's men held her arms to prevent her from protecting herself. Tony stood over her, his expensive leather jacket incongruous in the shabby apartment, his gold rings catching the light as he drew back for another blow. The Ghost didn't announce himself, didn't waste time with warnings or threats. He simply materialized behind the man holding Keisha's left arm and delivered a liver shot that dropped the enforcer like a puppet with cut strings. The second man had time to turn before Marcus's elbow caught him across the temple, sending him crashing into the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Tony Russo spun around, his hand reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband, but Marcus was already inside his guard, his fingers closing around Tony's wrist with the grip strength developed from years of grappling. The gun clattered to the floor as Marcus twisted Tony's arm behind his back and slammed him face first into the kitchen table. "You got about 5 seconds to explain why you're beating on this woman in front of her kid," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shouting could have achieved. Tony Russo was a man accustomed to intimidating people, to using violence and the threat of violence to get what he wanted. But pressed against the table with his arm bent at an angle that sent shooting pains through his shoulder, he found himself facing a different kind of threat entirely. Marcus Williams wasn't some desperate debtor or frightened shop owner. He was a professional who dealt in controlled destruction, and Tony could feel the difference in every ounce of pressure applied to his captured arm. The story that emerged was even uglier than Deshaun had described. Tony hadn't just been looking for his uncle's money, he'd been trying to extract a confession from Keisha to get her to admit to a theft that had never happened, so he could justify his suspicions to the rest of his crew. The beating had been going on for 20 minutes before Deshaun managed to slip out the door and run for help. Remembering the fighter he'd seen training at the gym near his school, the man other kids whispered about with a mixture of fear and admiration, Marcus released Tony and stepped back, putting himself between the loan shark and Keisha. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "You and your boys are going to walk out of here and never come back. You're going to tell everyone who asked that you made a mistake, that Keisha Miller had nothing to do with your uncle's money. And if I hear that you've come within 10 blocks of this building, if I hear that you've so much as spoken her name, I'm going to find you and finish what we started here tonight." Tony Russo wanted to argue, wanted to reassert the authority that had been stripped from him along with his gun. But the two men he'd brought with him were still struggling to breathe properly, and Marcus Williams stood between him and any chance of salvaging the situation through additional violence. So Tony did what predators do when confronted with a bigger predator. He retreated, gathering his injured crew and backing toward the door while trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "You don't know who you're messing with," Tony said from the doorway, the threat sounding hollow even to his own ears. Marcus didn't respond, just stood with his arms crossed until the three men had disappeared down the stairs. Then he turned to where Keisha sat against the wall, Deshaun pressed against her side despite her injuries, both of them trembling with the aftermath of fear and violence. The following weeks revealed the complexity of the situation Marcus had inserted himself into. Tony Russo's operation was connected to a larger criminal network that ran through Philadelphia's Italian neighborhoods, and his uncle's missing money represented a problem that couldn't be resolved simply by beating up a few loan sharks. The old man had apparently hidden over $200,000 in cash somewhere, money that represented years of loan sharking profits that had never been reported to his nephew or properly laundered through the legitimate businesses the family operated. Without that money, Tony was short on the payments he owed to his own suppliers, and desperate men made dangerous decisions. Marcus learned all of this through the network of fighters, trainers, and cornermen who formed the underground fighting community. Information flowed through the gyms and training facilities where men prepared for unsanctioned bouts, and Marcus Williams was respected enough that people told him things they might have kept to themselves otherwise. What he heard wasn't encouraging. Tony Russo was telling anyone who would listen that he'd been disrespected by some fighter who didn't understand how things worked in the neighborhood, and that he was going to make an example that would remind people why they paid their debts on time and showed proper respect to the people who ran things. The threat against Marcus himself didn't particularly concern him. Violence was the language he spoke most fluently, and he'd faced dangerous men in rings and alleys throughout his fighting career. But the implied threat to Keisha and Deshaun was something different entirely. The boy had come to him for help, had trusted him when he had no reason to trust any adult after what he'd witnessed. Marcus had made a promise when he'd ejected Tony Russo from that apartment, and the ghost didn't make promises he couldn't keep. The plan that took shape in Marcus's mind over the following days wasn't elaborate or clever. It was direct and brutal, matching the straightforward approach he'd always taken to problems in the ring. Tony Russo ran his loan sharking operation from a pawn shop, conducting business in a back office where he met with clients who needed money, and with those who'd fallen behind on payments. The shop was in a commercial district that emptied out after dark, with minimal foot traffic and neighbors who had learned not to ask questions about the sounds that sometimes came from Tony's office. Marcus spent 3 days watching the pawn shop, learning Tony's patterns and identifying the times when he was most vulnerable. The loan shark kept regular hours, arriving each morning at 10 and staying until 7 in the evening, with a break for lunch at a diner 2 blocks away. He employed 2 men as security, the same 2 who'd been holding Keisha when Marcus had interrupted their work, but they weren't professional bodyguards. They were just muscle enforcers who were effective at intimidating desperate people but who'd never faced someone with Marcus's training and experience. The move came on a Friday evening, the night before Marcus's scheduled fight with the Russian. He arrived at the pawn shop at 6:30 when Tony's security would be getting tired after a long day and thinking about their own evening plans. The front door was locked, but the back entrance that led to the alley was secured with a cheap padlock that Marcus defeated with a tire iron in less than 10 seconds. He moved through the storage area where Tony kept the merchandise taken as collateral, past racks of guitars and televisions and jewelry that represented other people's desperation, until he reached the office where Tony conducted his real business. The first security guard was sitting in a chair outside Tony's office, scrolling through his phone and not paying attention to anything beyond the screen. Marcus was on him before he could react. One arm wrapped around his throat in a rear naked choke that cut off blood flow to the brain. The guard struggled for perhaps 5 seconds before unconsciousness claimed him, and Marcus lowered him quietly to the floor before turning his attention to the office door. Tony Russo looked up from his desk as Marcus entered, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition to fear in the space of a heartbeat. He reached for the gun that Marcus knew he kept in the top drawer, but the ghost was already moving, crossing the office in 2 strides and slamming the drawer shut on Tony's fingers, with enough force to break at least 2 of them. Tony screamed and jerked his hand back, cradling the injured fingers against his chest while Marcus circled the desk to stand over him. "Remember me?" Marcus asked, though the question was purely rhetorical. "Remember the woman you were beating in front of her kid?" The second security guard burst through the door, having heard Tony scream. But Marcus had positioned himself so that Tony's body blocked any clear shot if the guard was armed. The Yase guard rushed forward anyway, and Marcus met him with a front kick to the midsection that folded him in half, followed by a knee to the face that left him sprawled across the office floor, with blood pouring from his broken nose. Tony was trying to get up from his chair, trying to reach the gun that had fallen from the desk drawer during the struggle. But Marcus kicked it away and grabbed Tony by the collar, lifting him partially out of the chair so they were face to face. "I told you what would happen if you came near that family again," Marcus said, his voice still carrying that same quiet menace. "But you couldn't help yourself, could you? Had to save face, had to prove you were still the tough guy. So now we're going to have a different conversation." What followed wasn't a fight. Fights implied some level of equality between participants. This was a systematic dismantling, a professional applying his craft to someone who had no defense against it. Marcus broke Tony's nose with a palm strike, then worked the body with combinations that cracked ribs and drove the air from his lungs. He targeted the liver, the kidneys, the solar plexus, all the points where pain could be inflicted without causing immediately visible damage. Tony tried to cover up, tried to protect himself, but Marcus had spent 15 years learning how to break through defensive guards, and Tony Russo's desperate flailing was no match for that experience. When Tony finally collapsed to the floor, curled into a fetal position and sobbing, Marcus crouched beside him and spoke in a voice that Tony would remember for the rest of his life. "Your uncle's money? It's gone. He donated it to a church before he died, wanted to make peace with God before the cancer took him. The pastor can show you the records if you ask nicely. But you're not going to ask because you're not going to talk about this ever again. You're going to tell your crew that the matter is settled, that you found out what happened to the money and there was no theft involved. And you're going to leave Keisha Miller and her son alone forever. Because if you don't, if I hear that you've come within a mile of them, I won't stop next time. I won't show mercy. I'll end you. Do you understand me?" Tony managed a nod, though Marcus wasn't sure how much of the message was getting through the pain and fear. But he'd made his point, had demonstrated the consequences of targeting people under his protection, and that would have to be enough. Marcus left the pawn shop the same way he'd entered, through the back door and into the alley where no cameras or witnesses could document his presence. He was back at his own apartment within 20 minutes, icing his knuckles and mentally preparing for the fight that was now less than 24 hours away. His hands were swelling from the impact against Tony's face and body, and he knew he'd be fighting at less than full capacity because of the injuries he'd inflicted on the loan shark. But things were more important than fights, and protecting a child who'd had the courage to ask for help was at the top of that list. The bout against the Russian the following night was brutal, exactly as Marcus had expected. His hands weren't responding properly, the swelling making it difficult to form tight fists, and the Russian was quick to capitalize on any weakness. Marcus took punishment that would have finished most fighters, absorbed blows to the head and body that left him spitting blood between rounds. But the ghost had always possessed a quality that transcended physical attributes, a mental toughness that allowed him to push through pain and exhaustion when lesser fighters would have quit. He weathered the storm, slipped punches when he could and absorbed those he couldn't, and waited for the moment when the Russian's aggression would create an opening. That moment came in the eighth round when the Russian overextended on a combination and left himself exposed for a fraction of a second. Marcus's left hook caught him on the point of the chin, the impact traveling through his injured hand like electricity but accomplishing its purpose. The Russian went down hard, not unconscious but too disoriented to beat the count, and Marcus Williams had somehow pulled victory from a fight he'd entered at a severe disadvantage. The purse from the victory allowed Marcus to do something he'd been planning since the night Deshawn had run to him for help. He used half the money to pay 3 months' rent on Keisha's apartment, working through an intermediary so she wouldn't know where the assistance was coming from. The other half went into a trust fund for Deshawn's education, a small seed that would grow over time and provide opportunities that the boy might not otherwise have access to. Marcus never told Keisha or Deshawn what had happened at the pawn shop, never sought credit or thanks for the intervention. The ghost operated in shadows for a reason, and some acts of justice were better left unacknowledged. But he did start spending more time at the gym near Deshawn's school, and when the boy started showing up to watch the fighters train, Marcus took him under his wing in the way that fighters had mentored him when he was young. Deshawn never became a fighter himself. His interests ran more toward academics than athletics. But the lessons he learned from Marcus Williams about standing up for people who needed help, about using strength to protect rather than intimidate, about keeping promises even when they were difficult, those lessons shaped the man he would become. He went to college on that trust fund Marcus had established, became a social worker who specialized in helping children escape violent situations, and spent his career providing for others the kind of intervention that had saved his mother's life. Tony Russo recovered from his injuries and, as Marcus had predicted, told his crew that the matter of his uncle's money had been resolved. He never explained exactly how, and none of his men were brave enough to ask after seeing the condition he'd been in following that Friday evening. The loan sharking operation continued, but Tony was noticeably more careful about who he targeted, and the story of what had happened to him spread through the criminal networks as a cautionary tale about picking the wrong victims. Marcus Williams fought for 3 more years before his body finally forced retirement. The injuries accumulated over 18 years of professional violence caught up with him, and even the ghost couldn't slip every punch forever. He transitioned into training younger fighters, passing on the technical skills and mental toughness that had sustained his career, but also teaching a philosophy about violence that he'd developed over decades. Fighting is a tool, he told his students. It's not about being tough or proving you're better than someone else. It's about having the ability to protect people who can't protect themselves. Everything I teach you is only worth something if you use it for the right reasons. Otherwise, you're just another bully with better technique. The story of what had happened between Marcus Williams and Tony Russo became legend in Philadelphia's underground fighting community. The details varied depending on who was telling it, but the core message remained consistent. The ghost had put his career on the line, had fought injured, and at a disadvantage because a child had asked for help. That kind of integrity, that willingness to sacrifice for people who had no claim on you beyond common humanity, that was the real measure of a fighter's worth. Years later, when Deshawn Miller graduated with his master's degree in social work, Marcus Williams sat in the audience watching the ceremony and feeling a satisfaction that no victory in the ring had ever provided. The boy who'd run to him in tears, desperate and terrified, had grown into a man who would spend his life helping others in similar situations. The cycle of violence that had threatened to consume Deshawn and his mother had been broken, replaced by a commitment to service and protection that would ripple outward in ways Marcus could never fully measure. In the end, that's what revenge was really about. Not the immediate satisfaction of inflicting pain on someone who deserved it, but the long-term work of ensuring that the person who'd been hurt could move forward without fear. Marcus had delivered brutal punishment to Tony Russo, had broken bones and inflicted pain that the loan shark would remember every time it rained for the rest of his life. But the real revenge was in what came after, in the life that Keisha and Deshawn were able to build because someone had been willing to stand between them and violence. The ghost had earned his nickname by being difficult to hit, by moving through opponents' defenses without leaving a trace. But his real legacy was in the people he'd protected, the lives he'd changed by being willing to absorb punishment on behalf of those who couldn't defend themselves. That was the kind of haunting that mattered. Not the fear he'd inspired in criminals, but the hope he'd given to a child who'd had every reason to believe that help wasn't coming. Marcus Williams never sought recognition for what he'd done, never told the story except in the vaguest terms to students who needed to understand why they were learning to hurt people. But in the gyms and training facilities throughout Philadelphia, in the social service agencies where Deshaun Miller worked to protect vulnerable families, and in the quiet apartments where people slept safely because someone had been willing to fight for them, the legend of the ghost lived on. Not as a violent man, but as a protector. Not as someone who sought out conflict, but as someone who answered when a desperate child ran to him for help and gasped out the words that would change both their lives forever. "They're beating my mama.